So how are you doing, Ian?
I'm doing very well.
Great. It's nice to meet you.
Thank you, Gina.
Now, you live out here on Nantucket, is that right?
And for August every year, I certainly do. But no, not year round.
Not year-round?
No.
But is it your family that has a house here, or is it you?
No, I just rent every year.
Why did you... Oh, you rent?
I do.
And why do you choose Nantucket?
Well, I mean, two things. First of all, because I'm from Boston originally, and so this really does feel like home a bit. And secondly, I think I realized when I wasn't taking proper vacation that I wasn't spending enough time with the people that I care about. And if you're going to take real time off and make sure that they actually come and spend time with you, you know, going off 5-10 hours away is not really going to cut it. Here everyone comes and visits, so it's really nice.
And how long have you been coming here?
I think this is my 8th year, actually.
8th year?
Yeah.
Consistently. Do you ever go anywhere else?
No, not for a long vacation. No, this is the only place I come.
Because you have to work so much?
No. I mean, a month is serious. I mean, I'll take a week here, a week there, but a month is serious vacation, and I'm delighted that I've gotten to the point that I'm actually getting some work-life balance around that sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah. Tell us what you do for a living.
I'm a political scientist, so I write. I think I try to understand how the world works.
How did you get into that? How did that all come about?
Well, I mean, a long time ago.
Yeah.
I guess it's because when I was a kid, I used to read The Economist and I'd played Risk. So, I mean, anyone in that environment's kind of a dork, but also clearly is interested in how the world works. That was when I was in high school. And when I went to college, I majored in poli-sci. My first ever trip outside the U.S. was in 1986 to the former Soviet Union. And, I mean, it's like going to China today, right? I mean, in '86, that's when Gorbachev first came in. That's when you had, you know, the beginnings, just the beginnings of the change that eventually led to the collapse. And what a fascinating place. It's clearly where things were happening. I ended up learning Russian. I traveled over there, lived there for a while.
You know, I was fascinated too. I think because of the Cold War and our relationship and the mistrust that we had. I think on a personal level, I wanted to find out why. You know, on a person-to-person level.
Why the mistrust today?
Yeah, well, no, then even. Oh. Why did we have this terrible mistrust for each other?
Well, back then I think ideology was a big part of it. I mean, the Soviets did have a worldview. It was very different from the United States. We both had, you know, sort of what we believed were exceptionalist, indispensable agendas. So, I mean, you know, if it was the Cold War, that's truly you're either with us or against us. And so we would fight over countries that didn't matter from a direct national interest perspective, but we wanted to keep the Soviets out. That's what containment was all about. You know, sort of George Kennan, the famous X article, that sort of thing. People say that it's the return of the Cold War today, and that's just not true, right? I mean, the Russians aren't as powerful. We don't care that much. Chinese aren't really with them. The Europeans aren't really with us. It's a very different environment. It's a dangerous environment. It's not the Cold War.
It is a crazy environment right now.
Yeah,
the world, and I think a lot of people would agree. Everywhere you look, things seem to be falling apart a little bit.
A little bit. Well, because, you know, the old world order, I mean, after World War II, we created that. It was our order, right? I mean, we made the United Nations. We made the Bretton Woods Accord on currency. We made the World Trade Organization. These were American organizations. I mean, they sounded global, but they're American organizations. And let's face it, number one, after Iraq and Afghanistan, we don't want to do that sort of thing anymore. That's had an impact on the feeling of Americans about being the global policeman. But also, our allies are distracted, the Europeans with their own crisis. The Germans are the most important there, and they're much more focused economically than on geopolitics. And
well, is that because they know that they have the U.S. in their back pocket? And
no.
They're policemen, so why should they?
Not at all. I think the Germans actually have a pretty tense relationship with the U.S. right now. I mean, they were upset with the way we went to war in Iraq. They're upset the way we went to war with Libya. And they're certainly upset about the spying and the surveillance with Snowden and the NSA.
Yeah.
But it's just a different worldview. And now, of course, you have China, which is soon going to be the world's largest economy. There's a very different perspective on the world from the U.S. So you put all that together, it's hard to imagine the world wouldn't come apart a little bit.
Doesn't the U.S. need to be the world's policeman? No. Doesn't someone need to do it?
Well, that's an interesting question, because no one's going to do it. So I guess the answer is, absent someone doing it, you're going to see 3 years of war in Syria and a couple 100,000 dead and over 10 million displaced. Population only has 21 million, so you're going to see the Islamic State in Iraq, and Syria right now. You're going to see Russia, Ukraine. You're going to see Israel, Gaza. I mean, things will happen if no one is the world's policeman. But it's very clear to me that we're not preparing to retake that role. And I don't just mean Obama. I mean, I don't care who you vote for in 2016.
Really?
We're not prepared to retake that role.
Would it be a different world if Romney was president right now? I mean,
yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, certainly some foreign policy would be different. But if you ask me, would we have a radically different policy in Syria? The Republicans, most of the Republicans weren't calling for, I mean, they were willing to criticize Obama, but they weren't calling for anything radically different. If you remember that Romney-Obama foreign policy debate when they were both running, I mean, they were complaining about Benghazi, but there were not particularly meaningful policy differences between the two presidential candidates at that point. So I'm not sure that a different president, certainly on the global policeman issue, would have much of an impact.
And then with your expertise in a lot of world affairs, let's talk about Russia and the Ukraine, for instance.
Yeah.
What Putin's problem is that he's afraid of losing that Soviet feeling, that they once had. Is it more personal for the Russians rather than just accepting the inevitability? I mean, isn't it inevitable with the world becoming smaller, with Twitter and Facebook, and young people wanting more freedom and expression? Doesn't it make more sense that he would just like not fight it?
Well, you know, I mean, from the Russian perspective, Ukraine is, without any question, their single most important foreign policy interest in the world. Of course, the base in Crimea, the big military base, but also, you know, Russia's the second largest arms dealer in the world. We're number one, but they're close. So it's very important to their economy. And the supply chain for the Russian military complex is overwhelmingly goes through southeast Ukraine, what they're fighting over right now. There was really no chance they were going to give this up. This matters so much more to them than it matters to us or it matters to the Europeans. So the notion that the Russians would accept the inevitable and say, well, Ukraine can just go, really is a misunderstanding of what the Kremlin's all about. And it's not, I mean, yes, Putin's a bad guy, but any Russian president would have a hard time with the policy outcome that was sort of being pushed onto the Russians by the Americans, by the Europeans.
But weren't the Ukrainians who, I mean, I've never been there, but I've known many Ukrainians.
Yeah.
And I know a little bit about what happens. It's an extremely corrupt country.
Yes.
Aren't they tired of the business as usual, the corruption as usual, and they see the West, they see the other Eastern European countries evolving and growing. Don't they want a piece of that for themselves, for the people?
You know, the Ukrainians are the big losers here, of course, and the big losers because of the Russians, but the big losers because of the West too. It's not as if the West really cares enough about Ukraine to try to fix their economy. We're not trying to do that. Their economy is in free fall right now. They're close to collapse. We're not going to fix that. Right. The Europeans aren't going to pay for it. I mean, it's true that most of the Ukrainians now really want the Russians to go to hell. But if you go to southeast Ukraine, which is what they're fighting over right now, I would say most of those Ukrainians, they don't want to join Russia, but they really hate this government in Kiev that is shelling them, that's bombarding them. And Putin's biding his time. He's been playing a fairly long game that's been going on for a few months right now, and if he has to invade, he will.
Yeah.
But he'd rather not. That's not his preference. He'd rather just ensure that he continues to have veto power over what goes on in that country.
He seems like in a much more powerful position than anyone because everybody's on their heels. The U.S. doesn't really want to engage unless Europe is fully involved, and they don't seem to be wanting to be too fully involved, right?
Well, I mean, after the plane MH17, Malaysian Airlines, was shot down, which clearly was at the hands of the separatists on the ground in southeast Ukraine, the Europeans supported tougher sanctions, and there's no question that this is hurting the Russian economy. They'll be in probably fairly serious recession this year because of these sanctions. So, I mean, it's punishing them, but it's not going to change their behavior in Ukraine. In fact, if anything, it'll probably make them harder on the ground there. So I guess the question you have to ask is, what's the purpose of the American sanctions? If the purpose is to show the world, unlike in Syria, that actually when we say something we do mean it, then we're doing that. But if the purpose is to change Russian behavior, and the purpose is to help Ukrainians, we're not doing that.
Yeah. as far as the rest of the world goes, I mean, how do you think we're doing? How do you think the direction in which the U.S. is heading? Are we heading in the right direction as a whole?
In terms of foreign policy, I think our country's in decline. I think our influence with allies around the world is generally deteriorating. I think if you look at most countries that consider us friends or have considered us friends in the past few years, you know, countries like Brazil and Germany and Saudi Arabia, big countries, I'd say those relationships have deteriorated. But I don't believe the U.S. economy is in decline. The dollar is very strong. You know, if you're Chinese, you're more interested in sending your kids to college here. You're more interested in buying an apartment or a house here.
Is that because their government could take the money from them? They're worried that could happen?
That's right. It is.
Why doesn't China become more stable? I mean, isn't that the only future?
That's one reason. But the other reason is because, you know, what are you going to do? Invest it in Europe or Japan where there's no growth? I mean, it's a cleanest dirty shirt argument.
Yeah, right.
But the Chinese do understand, I think they do understand that they need to become, I don't know if I'd say more like us, but certainly they need rule of law. They need to become an advanced economy. And that means having the kind of norms and stability and openness of a banking system and the rest that developed economies have. But when you built your economy for the last 35 years on the basis of a bunch of really, really powerful people becoming incredibly rich, and then you tell those guys, oh, actually, we're going to get rid of corruption, you'll have a lot of people very angry at you. And that's what's happening in China right now. It's quite dangerous to really try to change the system.
Yeah.
So I think that the president, Xi Jinping, the new president, I think he is serious about trying to really start to reform this economy in a transformational way, but it's very much an open question as to whether he'll be successful.
I think a lot of Americans think that our country is the only way to go. Now, that may be true as far as an open society, freedom of the press goes. But as far as, like, I've spent some time in Southeast Asia, I've been to Vietnam a few times. You know, it's pretty amazing how when a country wants to get something done, that's a centralized government like they have, they get it done. So what's there to be said about our form of government looking at other forms of government and judging them based on how different or how they're not like us? Or, you know what I mean?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, it really is incumbent on Americans, if we want to tell people to be like us, to actually be like us ourselves. I mean, if we say that we support democracy, we should support democracy at home.
Yep.
And if we say we support rule of law, we should do that. And if we're opposed to corruption, we should stop that.
On the whole?
You know, I mean, I think you look at the financial crisis and Madoff, and you look at the power of special interests in the United States, you look at the inability of Congress to pass legislation.
Those are big issues.
You look at things
on a personal level, I think people, on a like you to me,
yeah,
man in the street kind of deal. I think that you know, most people will help someone that's in need of help.
That's certainly true. I think our culture is very strong,
Yeah.
and I think the culture of entrepreneurship in this country is incredibly strong. Look, I'm very pro-American.
Yeah.
But being pro-American in America, I believe, really means being honest about when we're being hypocritical internationally, and especially because, you know, in 10, 20 years, we won't be the largest economy in the world. China will. It's going to be incumbent on us to lead more by example. And we don't do a great job of that. We like to tell other countries what to do, and we do criticize ourselves, but we don't necessarily live up to these things ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that can be true on human rights. It can be true on you know, sort of on lobbying. It can be true on a bunch of things. And I think it's gonna get harder. Americans don't like to see the world from other people's perspectives.
It's true.
And it's gonna be more important for us to do that.
I don't know why we are like that.
Well, we don't travel much. We have a big country. Most of us don't have passports. We don't speak other languages. I mean, in Europe, people travel a lot, but they travel within Europe. And if you think about how big America is, traveling within Europe isn't that impressive. But, I mean, how many people in Europe really get out and go to truly different cultures? How many people in America really go and see what sub-Saharan Africa is like or see what China's like? The answer is very few. I mean, Nantucket's a bubble, of course, and everyone here does, but we're so fortunate, we're so wealthy here. The average American doesn't do that, and the media doesn't help. So I think we're going to have to do a better job.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Boy, you touched on a very... You're an analyst.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
You get called on. Actually, that's how I met you. Someone from your office had called me and said, do we have a satellite feed in unfortunately, we don't. But you go on these talk shows?
Sure.
And, yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool. Is that part of your living, or is it?
I mean, I don't really make money that way.
How do you do that?
Well, I have a company that I do teach, but I have a company I started 16 years ago that looks at how politics affect the markets all over the world. So we basically we try to bring political science into the private sector.
Oh, and like a corporation would hire you to look at an emerging country that
for example,
they may want to invest in, and then you.
That's what the company does. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, that's very interesting. Wow. We could go on and on. I mean, you're a fascinating guy.
Thank you,
I knew
Gina.
this was going to be a great interview.
I appreciate it.
And thanks for sharing a little time with us.
Nice meeting you, man.
You
Good luck.
too.
Cool.